If our bodies are the foundation of our relationship, our stories end up being the glue that hold our relationship, our connection together. And if we don't make sure that the glue is strong and maintained, then it won't matter how solid the foundations are. They'll still come apart.
Hello and welcome back to the Experience of We. I'm Naomi.
And I'm Matthew. And we are in the midst of having a series of conversations with you about the nature of connection. Right now, in these early videos, we're sort of setting the stage, giving the foundation, the foundational concepts, I think, behind what we see as the nature of connection. And then we'll go into greater detail in future videos.
Yeah, and so in the previous video, I realized I wanted to take the talking stick on
Yeah,
this
please
one.
do. Take it.
In our previous videos in this series, we've talked about how connection is an embodied phenomenon. It's not something we choose or are obligated to or want to. Connection is embodied. Mm-hmm. And we also talked about how the wellness of our bodies impacts connection. Both receiving connection, being able to feel connection from others, and also giving it. It impacts our ability to show up in the ways we mean to with the energy and abilities that we want to bring to our relationships.
Mm-hmm. And so there is still yet a third layer to this, to the nature of connection that we see, and that is the narrative layer. The stories that we tell ourselves about our connection and the stories we tell each other about our connection. Mm-hmm. And this aspect is one that feels especially tender to me because I discovered in my childhood this layer, the narrative layer. I didn't have a lot of language for it, but there was a lot of disruption and dysfunction in my birth family. Everybody seemed to be at war, a sort of mostly a quiet war most of the time. Sometimes it would erupt and there would be these turbulent events, and sections of the family would break apart for a while, for weeks or months, or in some cases years, and then come back together. And then these eruptions happened throughout my childhood. I was the youngest member of my family, and so I was able to observe things and not engage as much in the sort of family drama, I guess you'd call it, the family dysfunction. And I noticed very early on that everybody had a different story about what was happening. And most of them told me their story about what was happening. And so I became almost like the repository of everyone's story about what was happening in my family. And I noticed they were all different. And I noticed that I needed to, if whoever told me their story, and everyone did, I needed to remember their version of the story and be able to both repeat it back to them. But I think even more crucial, I needed to act as if their story was true. There are these nonverbal ways that we know whether or not someone is, agrees with our story, believes our story, maybe. And so my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, my sister, for example, all had different stories about what was happening in the family. And I needed to be able to speak as if their story was the story, the main story, and also act in their presence as if it were true. And then when everyone was together, I had to be able to anticipate whose story I needed to act or speak as if it was true.
Man, that is such a good way to traumatize a kid.
Yeah, and if I'm being honest, I think most people are living some version of this.
Yeah, it's true.
I think I was living maybe an extreme version of this. And I think everyone that I have ever known has experienced similar dynamics in their family. You have too.
Yeah, definitely. In my family and in my friendships. Before Matthew and I started having intentional friendships where we brought in boundaries and things like that, I found myself ping-ponging between people in a social space, all of whom had their own story about what was happening in the social space and their own role in it. And I found myself just mirroring what all of them believed when I was in front of them.
Yeah. And so realizing as a young child and then as a young man that there are these stories that we tell about what's happening, and that everyone seems to have a story. And I started noticing that the distance, the narrative distance, the cognitive distance between two people's stories was correlated with the health of their connection. And so, if someone's stories are like this amount apart, like the strength of their connection seemed to be related to that. If people's stories were way apart, worlds apart, universes apart, oftentimes the health of their connection was really poor, might even be flatlined. I imagine we've all seen, I know I've had this experience, I know you had, of seeing connections that feel dead. They're still functioning. Sometimes people are still in a relationship, functionally in a relationship.
And might even report having fun together.
But the relationship itself doesn't feel fully alive. And so I felt like as a young person, I had discovered this secret. And so I started trying to coordinate the stories I had with my loved ones, with the closest people to me. And I would try to narrate the relationships as they were going. This is the experience we're having. This seems to be what we're feeling, right?
Updating as people showed their perspectives and feelings.
Right. And I found it very, very hard because if people weren't collaborating with me on telling the same story, the story of the relationship would inevitably drift. And also, sometimes trying to tell the true story of a connection means sometimes noticing uncomfortable truths. And I noticed when I tried to narrate in things like, I noticed that we're having some trouble here. Or I notice you're having some trouble with another one of your relational partners. There was a lot of resistance to that part of the story. And so it oftentimes seemed like if people wanted to participate in shared storytelling at all, that I needed to tell the story that they approved of. And oftentimes this wasn't explicit. It was implicit resistance to certain, basically, storytelling is just trying to make sense. From my perspective, storytelling is just trying to make sense of the relationship, to create a compressed artifact that says, this is the experience we're having together.
Yeah. Humans are always telling stories. One of the unique ways that we interact with our environment and experience continuity is we tell stories about it. Matthew took on this practice, as he was saying, when he was young, of making the story explicit and intentional. And the stories are always running in the background. We are always, as we go about life, as we go about our relationships, we're always having embodied sensations. We haven't seen each other for a while and we're going to see each other. I'm excited. That's a rush of neurochemicals. It's an embodied experience. Or we're experiencing a trigger and our bodies are going into a sense of unsafety together. My stomach is sinking, my heart is fluttering. That is a embodied experience we're sharing. And we are always telling a story about the sensations. We're always mapping them on to our own perspective and sense of what's unfolding. And sometimes the stories are obvious to us, like noticing when we're annoyed by something or when something feels good. And also there are stories that we're telling ourselves that aren't obvious, that we can't see. And so this is why coordinating our stories in relationship is so important. In the last video in the series, Matthew and I were talking about our food journey together, and how when Matthew was undernourished or underslept, our sleep journey, he would show up with more grumpiness and irritability.
Yeah.
If we weren't working on coming to the same story, I would have formed other stories about what was happening. I would have formed, okay, so Matthew doesn't like it when I ask him for help on these things, and I'm annoying when I do this, and also I resent him for this. And it would have been because we weren't collaborating to reach a shared story.
Right. Similarly, as we described in the previous video, Naomi, I needed Naomi's help to reduce the amount of processed sugars I was taking in. And sometimes when we had an agreement about it. It was consensual. And still sometimes when she would try to call me into integrity and remind me of my goal, I'd have this upsurge of, oh God, you're always doing this to me. You're trying to take away the things that I enjoy, was a narrative that would pop up in my mind. And if I didn't make sure that I consciously resisted that narrative and returned to the narrative of Naomi is helping me break my dependence on processed sugars. One story is against. One story is you are oppressing me and I resent you for it, even if we made an agreement. And the other story is you are trying to help me with something that is difficult and uncomfortable for me. Those are two very different stories. And they're not just stories, they're orientations. They're how I would orient to you. If I orient to you as someone who's trying to take my sugary snacks from me and take away the things I enjoy. And that did come up. Now you're the enemy. You're the other. But if I stay in the story that we crafted together, which is that I needed help breaking my dependence on processed sugars, now we're in it together. And so this practice is really tender to me because I carried it my whole life. And I've had a number of valuable relationships that felt crucial to me. I've experienced them end. I've experienced the end of relationships. I had a previous marriage. This is one of the most painful truths of my life, was I had a marriage that I never wanted to end. And it ended. And I watched our stories start very tightly coupled. My previous life partner, our story was pretty tightly coupled, and I watched our stories drift over time. I watched myself try to keep them close together, And then I saw myself sort of give up and just let them drift. And I watched them drift far enough for long enough that the relationship was no longer sustainable. And this still impacts me. And I brought this story to Naomi, and I told her that my lived experience was that the health of our relationship will be partially dependent on how close our stories of the relationship are. And that doesn't mean that the story always has to be that we explicitly agree about something. And if we don't, that's also a part of the story, a safe part of the story. And so as we continue making these videos about the nature of connection, we're going to be talking more about the stories that we tell ourselves, about our relationship, the ones that we publish, right? The ones we share, the ones that we withhold,
Yeah.
and how these show up in our relationships.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, you were talking about the impact of having a different story with someone that you're in a long-term relationship with, who you're in a commitment with. And uh, and that is important. And there's also this experience around stories in lower depth relationships, around the feeling of connection, the embodied experience of connection, depends on part on our ability to have a shared story with someone. And so I, for instance, before Matthew, had a lot of friendships where we'd get together for a drink every month, or whenever we were in the same town. And we had a mutual story of enjoying each other's presence and company, but we didn't have a shared story about what we were doing in the relationship, what we were really doing in our lives, not just what happened last week with our partner, but like what we're really doing here. We didn't have the level of intimacy where we could vulnerably share what our greater story was and where we could construct a conscious story together. And so, in terms of the embodied experience of connection, the reflexive extent to which we have a shared story is part of what creates the conditions where we can feel connection. And so shared story is so important for connection, both in terms of long-term relationships where we can really diverge in harmful ways without it, but also in lower stakes connections. I've had so many connections where it's like, I genuinely like this person, but I notice I don't have any upward energy to connect because I don't know what it is we're even doing together. I don't know why we're really doing this. And so, yeah, I wanted to add that.
Yeah, and you saying that sort of made me realize that if our bodies are the foundation of our connection, and I guess the imagery that's coming up is a brick wall. I don't know if I want this to be the final imagery for this idea, but the bricks are the foundation of a brick wall, and they also need the mortar to hold them together. The foundational piece isn't the piece that holds it together. And so if our bodies are the foundation of our relationship, our stories end up being the glue that hold our relationship, our connection together. And if we don't make sure that the glue is strong and maintained, then it won't matter how solid the foundations are. They'll still come apart. And we'll be exploring that idea in future videos.
Yeah, hear, hear.
So we thank you for taking this journey with us, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye.